Woodblock printing, Wikipedia article audio. Woodblock printing is a technique for printing text, images, or patterns used widely throughout East Asia and originating in China in antiquity as a method of printing on textiles and later paper. As a method of printing on cloth, the earliest surviving examples from China date to before 220 AD. Woodblock printing existed in Tang, China during the 7th century AD and remained the most common East Asian method of printing books and other texts, as well as images, until the 19th century. Ukiyo-e is the best known type of Japanese woodblock art print. Most European uses of the technique for printing images on paper are covered by the art term woodcut, except for the block books produced mainly in the 15th century in India. Prior to the invention of woodblock printing, seals and stamps were used for making impressions. The oldest of these seals came from Mesopotamia and Egypt. The use of round cylinder seals for rolling an impress onto clay tablets goes back to early Mesopotamian civilization before 3000 BC, where they are the most common works of art to survive, and feature complex and beautiful images. A few much larger brick stamps for marking clay bricks survive from Akkad from around 2270 BC. There are also Roman lead pipe inscriptions of some length that were stamped. An amulet MS 5236 may be a unique surviving gold foil sheet stamped with an amulet text in the 6th century BC. However, none of these used ink, which is necessary for printing, but stamped marks into relatively soft materials. In both China and Egypt, the use of small stamps for seals preceded the use of larger blocks. In Europe and India, the printing of cloth certainly preceded the printing of paper or papyrus. This was probably also the case in China. The process is essentially the same in Europe. Special presentation impressions of prints were often printed on silk until at least the 17th century. Seals and stamps. Technique. The woodblock is carefully prepared as a relief pattern, which means the areas to show white are cut away with a knife, chisel, or sandpaper, leaving the characters or image to show in black at the original surface level. The block was cut along the grain of the wood. It is necessary only to ink the block and bring it into firm and even contact with the paper or cloth to achieve an acceptable print. The content would of course print in reverse or mirror image, a further complication when text was involved. The art of carving the woodcut is technically known as xylography, though the term is rarely used in English. For color printing, multiple blocks are used, each for one color, although overprinting two colors may produce further colors on the print. Multiple colors can be printed by keying the paper to a frame around the wood blocks. There are three methods of printing to consider. In addition, jiuxia is a method for dyeing textiles using wood blocks invented in the 5th to 6th centuries in China. An upper and a lower block is made, with carved-out compartments opening to the back, fitted with plugs. The cloth, usually folded a number of times, is inserted and clamped between the two blocks. By unplugging the different compartments and filling them with dyes of different colors, a multicolored pattern can be printed over quite a large area of folded cloth. The method is not strictly printing, however, as the pattern is not caused by pressure against the block. The earliest woodblock printing known is in color Chinese silk from the Han Dynasty, printed in 3 colors. On paper, European woodcut prints with colored blocks were invented in Germany in 1508 and are known as chiaroscuro woodcuts. Color woodblock printing. Color is very common in Asian woodblock printing on paper. In China, the first known example is a diamond sutra of 1341, printed in black and red at the Zifu Temple in modern-day Hubei province. The earliest dated book printed in more than 2 colors is Qinshi Moiwan, a book on ink cakes printed in 1606, and the technique reached its height in books on art published in the first half of the 17th century. Notable examples are the Hu Zhenjun's treatise on the paintings and writings of the Ten Bamboo Studio of 1633, and the Mustard Seed Garden Painting Manual published in 1679 and 1701. In Japan, a multicolor technique, called nishiki, spread more widely, and was used for prints, from the 1760s on. Japanese woodcut became a major artistic form, although at the time it was accorded a much lower status than painting. History of woodblock printing. In both Europe and Japan, book illustrations were normally printed in black ink only, and color reserved for individual artistic prints. In China, the reverse was true, and color printing was used mainly in books on art and erotica. The earliest woodblock printed fragments to survive are from China and are of silk, printed with flowers in 3 colors from the Han Dynasty. It is clear that woodblock printing developed in Asia several centuries before Europe. The Chinese were the first to use the process to print solid text, and equally that, much later, in Europe the printing of images on cloth developed into the printing of images on paper. It is also now established that the use in Europe of the same process to print substantial amounts of text together with images in block books only came after the development of movable type, which was developed by Bai Sheng during the Northern Song dynasty of China, about 400 years later. In China, an alternative to woodblock printing was a system of reprography since the Han Dynasty, using carved stone steels to reproduce pages of text. The 3 necessary components for woodblock printing are the wood block, which carries the design cut in relief, dye or ink, which had been widely used in the ancient world, and either cloth or paper, which was first developed in China, around the 3rd century BC or 2nd century BC. Woodblock printing on papyrus seems never to have been practiced, although it would be possible. Origins in Asia. A few specimens of woodblock printing, possibly called tarsh in Arabic, have been excavated from a 10th century context in Arabic Egypt. They were mostly used for prayers and amulets. The technique may be spread from China or an independent invention, but had very little impact and virtually disappeared at the end of the 14th century. In India, the main importance of the technique has always been as a method of printing textiles, which has been a large industry since at least the 10th century. Large quantities of printed Indian silk and cotton were exported to Europe throughout the modern period. Early printed books in China and Korea. Because Chinese has a character set running into the thousands, woodblock printing suits it better than movable type to the extent that characters only need to be created as they occur in the text. Although the Chinese had invented a form of movable type with baked clay in the 11th century, and metal movable type was invented in Korea in the 13th century, wood blocks continued to be preferred owing to the formidable challenges of typesetting Chinese text with its 40,000 or more characters. Also, the objective of printing in the East may have been more focused on standardization of ritual text, and the purity of validated wood blocks could be maintained for centuries. When there was a need for the reproduction of a text, the original block could simply be brought out again, while movable type necessitated error-prone composition of distinct editions. Japanese woodblock prints. In China, Korea, and Japan, the state involved itself in printing at a relatively early stage. Initially only the government had the resources to finance the carving of the blocks for long works. The difference between East Asian woodblock printing and the Western printing press had major implications for the development of book culture and book markets in East Asia and Europe. Woodblock printing in China is strongly associated with Buddhism, which encouraged the spread of charms and sutras. In the Tang dynasty, a Chinese writer named Fen Zi first mentioned in his book Yuan Xian Sanji that the woodblock was used to print Buddhist scriptures during the Zhenguan years. Diffusion in Eurasia. The oldest existing print done with wood blocks was discovered in 1974 in an excavation in Xi'an, Shaanxi, China, whereby individual sheets of paper were pressed into wooden blocks with the text and illustrations carved into them. It is a Dharani Sutra printed on hemp paper and dated to 650 to 670 AD, during the Tang dynasty. Another printed document dating to the early half of the Chinese Tang dynasty has also been found, the Sadharma Pundarika Sutra printed from 690 to 699. An early example of woodblock printing on paper is the Great Dharani Sutra that is dated between AD 704 and 751. It was found at Bulgaksa, South Korea in 1966. Its Buddhist text was printed on a 8 cm x 630 cm mulberry paper scroll in the early Korean Kingdom of Unified Silla. Another version of the Dharani Sutra, printed in Japan around AD 770, is also frequently cited as an example of early printing. 1 million copies of the sutra, along with other prayers, were ordered to be produced by Empress Shitoku. As each copy was then stored in a tiny wooden pagoda, the copies are together known as the Hyakumant Dharani. The world's earliest dated printed book is a Chinese scroll about 16 feet long containing the text of the Diamond Sutra. It was found in 1907 by the archaeologist Sir Mark Orlstein in the Majao caves of Dunhuang, and is currently in the possession of the British Library. The book displays a great maturity of design and layout and speaks of a considerable ancestry for woodblock printing. The colophon, at the inner end, reads, "Reverently made for universal free distribution by Wang Ji on behalf of his two parents on the 13th of the 4th moon of the 9th year of Xian Tong." In late 10th century China, the complete Buddhist canon Tripitaka of 130,000 pages was printed with blocks, which took between 1080 and 1102, and many other very long works were printed. Early books were on scrolls, but other book formats were developed. First came the Jingzhuang or sutra binding, a scroll folded concertina-wise, which avoided the need to unroll half a scroll to see a passage in the middle. About AD 1000 butterfly binding was developed. 2 pages were printed on a sheet, which was then folded inwards. The sheets were then pasted together at the fold to make a codex with alternate openings of printed and blank pairs of pages. In the 14th century the folding was reversed outwards to give continuous printed pages, each backed by a blank hidden page. Later the bindings were sewn rather than pasted. Only relatively small volumes were bound up, and several of these would be enclosed in a cover called a tau, with wooden boards at front and back, and loops and pegs to close up the book when not in use. For example, one complete Tripitaka had over 6,400 won in 595 tau. The earliest known woodblock printing dates from 764 to 770, when Empress Shotoku commissioned 1 million small wooden pagodas containing short printed scrolls typically 6 cm x 45 cm to be distributed to temples. Apart from the production of Buddhist texts, which became widespread from the 11th century in Japan, the process was only adopted in Japan for secular books surprisingly late, and a Japanese dictionary of 1590 is the earliest known example. 15th century Europe. Though the Jesuits operated a movable type printing press in Nagasaki, printing equipment which Toyotomi Hideyoshi's army seized from Korea in 1593 had far greater influence on the development of the medium. 4 years later, Tokugawa Ieyasu, even before becoming shogun, effected the creation of the first native movable type, using wooden type pieces rather than metal. He oversaw the creation of 100,000 type pieces, which were used to print a number of political and historical texts. Further development in East Asia. An edition of the Confucian Analects was printed in 1598, using a Korean movable type printing press, at the order of Emperor Goizei. This document is the oldest work of Japanese movable type printing extant today. Despite the appeal of movable type, however, it was soon decided that the running script style of Japanese writing would be better reproduced using woodblocks, and so woodblocks were once more adopted. By 1640 they were once again being used for nearly all purposes. The technology quickly gained popularity among publishers, and was used to produce affordable prints as well as books. As a result, Japan began to see something of literary mass production and increasing literacy. The content of these books varied widely, including travel guides, advice manuals, kaibashi, sharaban, art books, and play scripts for the Jairuri theater. Often, within a certain genre, such as the Jairuri theater scripts, a particular style of writing would come to be the standard for that genre. In other words, one person's personal calligraphic style was adopted as the standard style for printing plays. The technique is found through South and Central Asia, and in the Byzantine world for cloth, and by AD 1000 examples of woodblock printing on paper appear in Islamic Egypt. Printing onto cloth had spread much earlier, and was common in Europe by 1300. In the 13th century the Chinese technique of block printing was transmitted to Europe, soon after paper became available in Europe. The print in woodcut, later joined by engraving, quickly became an important cultural tradition for popular religious works, as well as playing cards and other uses. Many early Chinese examples, such as the Diamond Sutra, contain images, mostly Buddhist, that are often elaborate. Later, some notable artists designed woodblock images for books, but the separate artistic print did not develop in China as it did in Europe and Japan. Apart from devotional images, mainly Buddhist, few single-leaf Chinese prints were made until the 19th century. Types of wood used by the Chinese. Materials other than paper. Notes. Block books, where both text and images are cut on a single block for a whole page, appeared in Europe in the mid-15th century. As they were almost always undated and without statement of printer or place of printing, determining their dates of printing has been an extremely difficult task. Alan H. Stevenson, by comparing the watermarks in the paper used in block books with watermarks in dated documents, concluded that the heyday of block books was the 1460s, but that at least one dated from about 1451. Block books printed in the 1470s were often of cheaper quality, as a cheaper alternative to books printed by printing press. Block books continued to be printed sporadically up through the end of the 15th century. The most famous block books are the Speculum Humani Salvat Ionis and the Ars Moriendi, though in this the images and text are on different pages, but all block cut. The Biblia Pauperum, a biblical picture book, was the next most common title, and the great majority of block books were popular devotional works. All block books are fairly short at less than 50 pages. While in Europe movable metal type soon became cheap enough to replace woodblock printing for the reproduction of text, woodcuts remained a major way to reproduce images in illustrated works of early modern European printing. Most block books before about 1480 were printed on only one side of the paper. If they were printed by rubbing, it would be difficult to print on both sides without damaging the first one to be printed. Many were printed with 2 pages per sheet, producing a book with opening of 2 printed pages, followed by openings with 2 blank pages. The blank pages were then glued together to produce a book looking like a type-printed one. Where both sides of a sheet have been printed, it is presumed a printing press was used. The method was also used extensively for printing playing cards. In East Asia, woodblock printing proved to be more enduring than in Europe, continuing well into the 19th century as the major form of printing texts, especially in China, even after the introduction of the European printing press. In countries using Arabic, Turkish and similar scripts, works, especially the Quran, were sometimes printed by lithography in the 19th century, as the links between the characters require compromises when movable type is used, which were considered inappropriate for sacred texts. Nianhua were a form of colored woodblock prints in China, depicting images for decoration during the Chinese New Year. Dr. Henry, in his Notes on the Economic Botany of China, refers to your wish to obtain specimens of the woods used in China for printing blocks. The name which the neighboring city of Wuchang enjoys for the excellence of its printing work has led me to inquire into the woods used there, and I am sending you specimens of them by parcel post. The wood which is considered the best is the Veng Li Mu, which has been identified as the Pyrus betulsfolia, bungi, and which grows in this province. Slabs of this wood 1 foot x 6 ins. x 1 in. Cost 150 cash, or about 5.5d. A cheaper wood generally used for printing proclamations is the Tu Chung Mu. Euchemia ulmoides, Olive, has been determined to be the Tu Chung Mu. The Tu Chung here used is a native of this province. A wood used in Kiangsu is the Yin Xing Mu, which is one of the names of the Salisburia adiantifolia. Boxwood, Huang Yang Mu, is obtained from Zekahuan, but only in small pieces, which are mainly used for cutting the stamps used for private seals on letters and documents. In the 3rd volume of the Japanese work, the Somon Sei Fu, a drawing is given of the Huang Yang, together with a quotation from the Chinese Materia Medica, which speaks of the tree as growing an inch a year, except in these years which have an intercalary moon, when it grows backwards. From this it would appear to be a slow-growing tree. W. R. Carles, Esq., to Royal Gardens, Q., dated Her Majesty's Consulate, Hankow, July 25, 1896. Block printing has also been extensively used for decorative purposes such as fabrics, leathers, and wallpaper. This is easiest with repetitive patterns composed of one or a small number of motifs that are small to medium in size. For a multicolor pattern, each color element is carved as a separate block and individually inked and applied. Block printing was the standard method of producing wallpaper until the early 20th century, and is still used by a few traditionalist firms. It also remains in use for making cloth, mostly in small artisanal settings, for example in India. William Morris was one artist who used woodblock printing to produce patterned wallpaper and textiles during the late 19th century. Examples of Morris' work are housed in the Victoria and Albert Museum. The museum also holds a number of Morris original woodblocks, which are still in limited use.